Turning around, talking to me. I was behind the driver. My mother, my brother was behind my grandmother, and I was giving him Fireball, candy. And so she had said to me, don't give that to him, he could choke. I don't know why I remember that, but she did. And off to the left, there was a sphere that rose out of the water, and it rose up 2 or 3, I don't know, maybe, I'm going to say maybe 75 or 80 yards high. And we were looking at it closely. It was like a cue ball. It was very sharp around the edges. It didn't bleed light, but it put off like a little bit of a light, like a glow. And then it fired these 2 rods of light that reminded me of a sugar cone, an ice cream cone. And then those beams or those rods of light retracted back into the sides of it. It did come out the bottom of the side. There were only 2 of them that I remember. And it started going behind a line of trees, and we kept going down this dirt road. Now the bridge, as you can tell, was pretty ratty. So there was when we went up it, we almost like bottomed out, went across the planks, and when you came down, you had to be really careful. We weren't going more than 5 or 10 miles an hour. And at that point, there was a second sphere, if you will, which was much smaller, which was orange in color, and it seemed to move on the inside. It almost looked like it was alive. My brother said, it was to the right of my brother, so he had a better view of it, but he said it was like an orange, like a roll, like an ocean wave. It kind of turned and moved. And it was probably around, 15, 20 feet round, whereas the one to our left was larger than a Volkswagen. And so the orange one stayed in the water, and the white one kind of rose up, and you could see this little red car is a depiction of us. And as we went forward, my mother stopped to see if she could spot the white sphere. And in doing so, we saw what looked very much like a turtle shell, a huge 100-yard turtle shell hovering about 2 stories high, and it was just massive. And we stopped. The car was running, the lights were on, we're all looking out the window, and we're trying to make sense of what we're seeing, really. And my mother noticed, that the front of it was putting out, like, emitting a light. And we all kind of focused on that. And before you know it, you could make the whole shell of this thing out, which to me looked like a turtle shell. I mean, that's how I've always referenced it. It didn't have landing gear. There weren't any windows. It looked like that. And to me, it almost looked alive. Like the center almost had like a snake skin, and the top and the bottom had like panels in it. So it looked to me as a child like a huge turtle shell. Now, when we came to a stop, or came just as we noticed this thing and started to slow down, it was like there were crickets, the noises of just natural life, the wind, crickets, katydids, frogs, whatever what normal life would be at 8:30 at night, just went like a switch. It was off, and it felt like we were deep underwater, like we had been thrown to the bottom of a swimming pool. And then at one point, it was almost like I couldn't breathe. There was a flash of light. I could see the inside of the vehicle. I could see the radio. I could see the back of my mother's head. I could see, everything really clearly, but at the same time, the light didn't bother my eyes. And the next thing I know, I'm in what looks like an airplane hangar. And I was slid off a table. I was brought to a room where I was put on like this, almost like an autopsy table. It had like one rod in the middle of it. It rose up, another, apparatus came down from the ceiling, and I was like sandwiched in between these things. There were holes on the side of this rack. There were, hands came through the side. They were put looked like giant raisins on my body. I remember all this like it was yesterday. And then the next thing I remember was like a bump to the head. I was back in this large empty room, and then back in the vehicle. Now, my brother remembers something very similar. My mother remembers hearing voices. My grandmother remembers pretty much the same thing as my mother does. But what was really interesting as well is that they weren't back in the same seats. My mother was in the passenger seat now, where my grandmother was sitting, and my grandmother was in the driver's seat. I was still in the same spot, my brother was in the same spot, but they were reversed. And the ignition on the car was off. And my mother had it running and the lights were on. So my grandmother, because my mother wouldn't respond to her, decided to drive back to town for help, because none of us were awake. Now, she didn't really drive, and when Unsolved Mysteries, we talked about that on Unsolved Mysteries, that's true. She didn't drive. She had a license, but she didn't really drive. So this is like a little bit of a film, if you will, or a clip that kind of portrays what happened pretty accurately. I had actually gone into a store with her. She ran in to use the phone to call the police, although she didn't really know what to ask for. How do you ask for help for something you don't know what's going on? The paramedics never showed up, but Eddie Galata and the police department did go out and research and look for the craft. So she was like kind of walking aimlessly into Silk's store, which is still there to this day. And I walked in behind her and I was trying to grab her, like, Nana, what's going on? I was the second one in the vehicle to wake up. And she really didn't know what to say. She didn't know. The clerk came out, but she was like, never really said anything to him. And she had gotten tied up behind some bikes and strollers, and I was grabbing her arm and trying to pull her towards me. I don't know why, because it didn't make sense, because there were strollers and things in the way. He knew something was wrong. And what's interesting, Silks is still there to this day. They still remember this. She grabbed a stroller, started pushing it back and forth as if there was a baby in it. I started grabbing her to leave. I was shaken, but we all kind of came out of this at different times. My grandmother came out of it first, I came out of it second, then my mother, and then my brother. And we all felt like we were drugged in some way. We didn't all come out of it at the same time. It's my grandmother. So we've always felt that there was a military involvement. There was more than one thing going on. And we tried to make sense of what that is. My mother spoke on Unsolved
I
Mysteries.
had recently acquired a little restaurant called the Village Green in the middle of Sheffield, which was kind of a place where a lot of people gathered and met.
My name is Melanie Kirchdorfer. I've lived here since 1957. I was 12 years old in 1969.
Now, as we started through the covered bridge, I had recently acquired a little restaurant called the Village Green in the middle of Sheffield, which was kind of a place where a lot of people gathered and met.
My name is Melanie Kirchdorfer. I've lived here since 1957. I was 12 years old in 1969.
Now, as we started through the covered bridge, Thomas was in the backseat with Matthew, his younger brother. He loved those little, we call them fireballs, hot brown things, and he was going to give one to Matthew. And my mother heard that, and she turned around and she said,
"Hey, you could choke. Don't give that to him. He's too young." And when she turned around and facing the back of the station wagon, she noticed what looked like a light rising from the banks of the Housatonic River.
and as we exited the bridge, I can remember this like yesterday, there was a light bulb hovering, maybe about 2 stories high. We were amazed. I mean, we'd never seen anything like it. It was glowing.
And then as it rose, it fired these rods of light. Everyone was focused on this thing, but for some reason, my brothers tend to look to the right.
The atmosphere got really close. Everything was dead quiet.
We felt like we were underwater. We could feel like a pressure change. We all started looking out the side of the car. Grandma's looking out. Everyone's looking at, where is this white sphere that we saw moments ago? And then bang, my mother notices this thing first in the sky, and she's like, "My God, what is that?"
There was a disc-shaped object hovering there. It looked something like if you ever took a turtle shell and turned it sideways and looked at it. It was like that, and then it was a little shorter under here, but in the middle there was a different ridge to it.
The craft itself I would say that it had to be at least 100 yards long.
I mean, usually you have some summer noises, and everything was deadly still and silent. Then all of a sudden the chirping started, loudly, it erupted, crickets.
My whole life changed right here. This was a moment that forever changed my life.
Something weird took place here. We were a part of it.
So that's what it looked like. I've had the depiction done, and I can't come up with anything any closer. What I would tell you is that what struck me was that the middle band, if you will, made up the lion's share of it. It was at least 3/4 the size of the craft itself, and reminded me of a snakeskin. It's always given me that feeling. And at the top again, looked more like a turtle shell. And the only light coming off of it was on the top. Really, that light there is just, you know, it's added, if you will. So here's some, I guess, the outer shell actually gave out the light. It wasn't, no lights are coming from it. It was just the sheen that it put out. Again, turtle shell was 100 yards in size, and the center reminded me of a snakeskin. And so with that, the orange sphere, if you will, off to the right reminded me of that. That's probably the closest thing that I could come up with. And again, it stayed near the water. It hovered about 10 or 15 feet above the water at the Housatonic River, not far from the bridge. And it was off to the right of the car. And then this is actually pretty close. This was something that Ancient Aliens put together. Now, what's wrong with that is that the sphere itself never stopped our car. We stopped the car, so that looks like it prevented us from driving. But even though it's pretty close, this is actually more of what it actually looked like. As elementary as that may appear, it had two that fired from the sides, not really the bottom, and it was disturbing the water at the bottom. And so as it rose, those rods came out, it continued to rise, the rods stayed in place, and then they retracted and it moved forward. This is the original article that talked about our event in this is 1967. So the event that made the news, if you will, 1969, was not the only incident. There was 66, 67, 69, and there was another in the 70s as well. The problems that we had being from New York City and moving to this remote area was that, you know, we were outsiders to begin with. So when we started talking about what we were involved with in 67, we just became, you know, targets, if you will, for the local, you know, kind of the kids, if you will, and their parents as well. But in here, it talks about Sheffield, it talks about the sphere, it talks about pretty much everything I'm discussing to this day. It was also given a Heinecker, if you will, or a classification, a CE1 classification at the same time, which also you would think that Unsolved Mysteries, being a document-driven program, might have found that to be something of interest as well. There again is the bridge. At the time that we drove over it, what it really looked like wasn't very inviting to begin with. Now, if you go back to the area, the corn grows at an enormous rate. Now, I like corn like everyone else, but that corn is about as long as your arm and grows to be close to 50 feet in height. So here is a woman who's 6 feet tall. And that is right at the same area where this event took place. Something else you would have thought Unsolved Mysteries might have mentioned. Now, there's still spheres seen in broad daylight. There's crop circles. There were crop circles in 2013. There were crop circles in 2014. BLT Research actually looked into it. Those are the markings. That's the corn. It actually looks like it's burned. And these are the same object, if you will, taken by two different cameras, and the markings that are left behind. That was in broad daylight. Here's another article from the Berkshire Eagle, the Berkshire Record, from 1995, also leaving markings in the ground there. Now keep in mind, this is only an hour and a half from here. And a bird's eye view. Now, how this made history? Well, Sprague Electric was working on the space race. Again, the funding was coming from the government through NASA in Boston. It was going to Sprague and GE and a few others. And again, this was right down the road from us, maybe half an hour, door to door. Again, there's some articles you can Google this yourself and find, how involved they were. But that was the medallion, if you will, of the goodwill message that was left on the moon by Buzz Aldrin, who ate in her family's diner and knew my family. And this is Robert Bletchman. He was actually the public relations director for MUFON in the 90s. He knew my father. He was also an attorney, and who organized the United Nations Symposium on Extraterrestrial Intelligence and the Human Future, along with Stan Friedman, good friend of Kathy's, was also involved in that, as was, Linda Martin. And that's the date that I went to the UN, October 2nd, 1992. And there's a letter from MUFON, from Jan Harzane, and I've got another one from David McDonald, who also worked with the state of Massachusetts to see what they could do about validating some of this stuff, because as a collective, it really paints a good picture. And then my father, who lost his life on the same day, along with his letters from Senator Chris Dodd as he was in office, and how he lost his life at 54 years old after discussing things he probably shouldn't have mentioned at the time. So, this gentleman decides to knock on my door and start asking me questions about my father. How did he still have this property? Did he travel internationally? Was he savvy with computers? And this guy's name was Adam, and he worked for Key Point Government Solutions, which was a department of Kroll, and also that worked with Homeland Security. I still have his business card, and it's actually in Elizabeth's house as we speak, right down the road from here. So I took a polygraph test. I passed that. O negative blood. Most of our family members do. My brother's A negative, my brother's A negative, my father was O negative. I'm one. There's like 9 of us in our direct family that is O negative blood. So we try to look into, what is it about our family? What is it, that why us, right? Everyone asks that, why you? Well, there's 9 of us that are O negative. And I have a very, I don't know why having O negative blood, and if anybody in here is O negative, I'm sure you know that your body temperature runs a little below normal, 97.1, 97.5. Your blood type should not alter your entire body's body temperature. So I do believe that there are a species within a species. That includes us. Again, my polygraph test. So we did a TV show a while back, and the polygraph examiner, Steve White, was a detective who was also there at the time, who also I think knows Kathy, found someone for me to give me the test, and this is him.
The evidence was pretty astounding compared to most cases.
But how to convince a skeptical world?
Tom Reed, he said that he was willing to take a polygraph. I thought it was a good way to verify that he was telling the truth.
I said, have you realized with all probability your client's going to fail? He said, well, maybe, we'll see. Both sides. Skeptical? Yes.
I spent probably an hour and a half, I'd say, going over everything regarding our case, everything from 1966 to 2010. And he had a lot of questions, and a lot of them were generic and some were more specific. And at the end of the day, I passed with a 99.1% no deception indicated.
My conclusion was he was being truthful when he said he was not trying to mislead.
And again, this is one of the letters from the Historical Society of Massachusetts, which we're somewhat proud of. And there's the letter from Governor Charles D. Baker, which inducted our case into United States history. a case that went in support of the Hudson River Valley sightings. There's actually two. There's a date there. I think that's October. Here's another one in November, so we have more than one. And again, these are some of the witness testimonies that actually went to state from our neighbors and people we, I haven't lived in that area since 1977, and all these witnesses have come forward. There's over 250 witnesses. It then made the cover of the Boston Globe, the Drudge Report, Chicago Tribune, and others. So we go back to the Berkshire UFO episode, which is nothing more than a rebranding of our family's incident. And not a single, anything I just showed you was in that program. So there is talk about redoing it and actually doing a documentary type of docudrama, if you will, on our family by some of those who were involved with the Matrix Reloaded, with a lot of funding coming out of Australia. So we have a park now in Massachusetts. There's actually a monument, if you will, or a marker or sculpture that was donated by History Channel's Ancient Aliens or Prometheus. There's also benches. Ben Hansen has a bench there. My good friend Travis has a bench there. Mike Barra, Unsolved Mysteries. My God, there's so many. Now there's the family of B.B. King. His daughter Rita has donated a bench along with Tyrone Vaughn, the nephew of Stevie Ray. And again, this is about an hour and a half from here. And now I'm going to show you some footage. An actual sighting, if you will, in the area. Again, that's the sphere that we see a lot. Now you're going to see it at night.
There's 4 of them.
Where's the fourth one?
Over to the right. Huh?
There's another one.
Hear me? There's like 5 of them lit up now. Whoa, that one just came into light too. Holy cow, there's...
All right, so I think I'm doing pretty good for time. I've got actually like a 10-minute clip from Ancient Aliens that actually comes to the bridge, looks at the park, actually does an entire investigation for about 10 minutes. Do you want to play that, or do you rather ask questions, or how would you like to spend the last 15 minutes?
We want to see it.
You want?
Yes.
Okay. Let's do it. Love the energy here. Okay. I think it's just about 9 minutes.
And is there a smoking gun that will finally establish that this phenomenon is real and still underway? Perhaps further clues can be found by examining one of